Hello everyone, welcome to the Bedtime Story channel. In this video, I will share a mystical story adapted from a true story. If you're interested in reading the original text, I'll include a link in the description. Thank you. Let's hear the story. Mount Sumbing, 1998. When the boundary between life and death hangs by a thread. In December 1998, at that time, I was not yet 17 years old, and I was still in my second year of high school. One afternoon, during the second break, one of my friends approached me while I was casually smoking in the back corner behind the school toilet. Yes, one of my mischievous behaviors at that time was smoking. I hoped that no one would imitate such actions. He was Anton, my desk mate and also one of my climbing partners. Darn it, I searched everywhere in the cafeteria, couldn't find you. Turns out you're hiding here, having a romance with the smoke, he said. Here, I replied briefly while handing him a fresh cigarette that I had just lit. Anton took it and immediately took a puff. Back then, we were accustomed to sharing a cigarette to enjoy together. Among us, we commonly referred to it as a joining. Let's climb next week, Anton suggested. Where to? I asked. How about Sumbing? Anton proposed. I'm running low on funds, I replied, signaling the thinness of my pocket. Easy. I have this much, just need a bit more, it should be enough. Well, at least for the trip, provisions, and cigarettes. Coming back will be easy, we can stop by at my relative's place in Temenggong and ask for a ride home, ha ha ha, he said. Let's go, I chimed in. Yes, that's how we were back then when planning our climb. Just a little confidence was enough to solidify our departure. The rest would be figured out along the way. Please understand, the fiery spirit of youth sometimes led us to overlook the risks that might arise from reckless actions without careful consideration. But from all those experiences, we learned to consider everything more carefully, calculate risks, and make anticipations in our subsequent journeys. The designated day for the climb to Mount Sumbing finally arrived. Boldly leaving school during the first break on a Saturday, Anton and I quickly headed to the bus terminal. Before boarding the bus that would take us to the base camp of Mount Sumbing in Garong Village, Wannasobo, we stopped by the terminal restroom to change out of our school uniforms into casual clothes. Despite being quite rebellious during school, we were committed to maintaining the school's reputation by not wearing our school uniforms when skipping classes, as our school was considered one of the favorites in our city. Once everything was ready, we promptly boarded the bus that was ready to depart, with the final destination being Purwokerto, passing through Temenggong and Wannasobo along the way. The bus has now started moving. After paying the fare, we rested as the journey would take quite a while. I noticed Anton showing no signs of life. With his distinctive sleeping style mouth wide open, he looked sound asleep. I also tried to sleep, but since I attempted to close my eyes, it felt incredibly challenging to immerse myself in the world of dreams. There was a nagging feeling in my heart that proved difficult for me to comprehend. I just observed the direction of the bus window, dampened by the rain on the outside. It was a common occurrence during this season. Perhaps by staring outside, I could feel drowsy and eventually drift off on my own. The trick I tried turned out to be quite successful. Slowly, I felt my eyes getting heavier. Before long, I had completely lost consciousness. As I slept, I experienced a rather strange dream. In my dream, I seemed to be in the midst of a large crowd. Looking around, I found myself in the middle of a city. However, I couldn't recognize this city. What was clear, there were many tall buildings, and the streets looked very wide, unlike the streets in my hometown. Shortly after, people around me started running in all directions without a clear purpose. Not long after, flames erupted everywhere, with thick smoke billowing. This event reminded me of the May 1998 riots in Jakarta, but there was a striking difference. Why could I say it was different? Because news about demonstrations, reform, and riots in various regions of Indonesia at that time I always followed through television broadcasts. Even though I was still in high school at that time, in my mind, the desire to join the university students on the streets to voice the truth and justice was so strong. Not long after, from behind a quite tall building, a creature appeared that might be considered a supernatural being by people. However, in my dream, I didn't see very clearly what its form was like. What was certain, the creature looked tall and large. In a matter of seconds, the creature went berserk, grabbing people around me and devouring them. I became very frightened and panicked, trying to run somewhere, just attempting to avoid the creature. Unfortunately, it spotted me. It began to chase me. In my escape, in the distance, I saw both of my parents standing and smiling. As I was about to move towards them, suddenly I saw the creature's hand swing towards me. I noticed there was some kind of long and sharp claw. What kind of dream is this? I pondered. I looked beside me, and Anton was still asleep with his characteristic style. I looked outside to recognize how far this journey had gone. It turned out the bus had reached Temanggung. That meant we would arrive in Garong shortly. It turns out, I slept quite a long time earlier, but in the dream, it felt like only a few minutes had passed. I took a deep breath and exhaled quickly, as if I were releasing all the burdens on my mind. I woke up Anton and invited him to smoke at the back, near the door. I thought, instead of dwelling on that unclear dream, it would be better to chat while smoking in the back. Who knows, maybe there's a beautiful girl there who can refresh our eyes. After smoking a few cigarettes and chatting with the bus crew, we finally arrived at Garong village. I breathed in the cool air at the foot of Mount Sumbing, which is also close to Mount Sindoro due to their adjacent locations. I filled every corner of my lungs with the fresh mountain air. It felt so invigorating, vastly different from the urban air filled with pollution. I saw several people with the distinctive appearance of hikers around here. Perhaps they, too, were going to climb Mount Sumbing like me. Although it was the weekend, the atmosphere wasn't too bustling. This was understandable, considering it's currently the fasting month. Many hikers choose to take a temporary break during the fasting month. This is different from the choice Anton and I made to continue our mountain climb even during this holy month. Neither of us was observing fasting. Truly, our past actions are now a source of regret. I hope for those reading this not to emulate our behavior. After loosening our muscles and alleviating the fatigue from the quite lengthy bus journey, we began to make our way towards the base camp of Mount Sumbing, which was located almost at the edge of the village. The base camp location was quite far from the main road. Although we could have hired a motorcycle taxi, Ojek, considering our limited budget, we decided to allocate the money more towards additional logistics instead. If you've ever climbed Mount Sumbing via Garong and come across a large sign that reads as Stikpala, then that's where the base camp of Mount Sumbing used to be. However, as far as I know, it has now been relocated a bit downhill, closer to the main road. Upon reaching the base camp, we reported our arrival and registered with the officials. As usual, the mountain climbing registration process at that time was very straightforward. Simply using our identification cards, ID cards, driver's license, or student cards, and paying a very affordable fee, we were officially recognized as climbers. We received 2 sheets of paper containing the regulations for entering the Mount Sumbing area and the climbing route map. Additionally, we were given tickets as proof of registration. Until the late afternoon, we spent our time lounging in the large pavilion provided by the base camp. We rested, waiting for the time to begin our climb after the evening prayer. In the past, we indeed enjoyed nighttime climbing. Our reasoning back then was that climbing at night was more comfortable due to the cooler air, and the terrain wasn't perceived as challenging as it would be during the day. Understandable, at that time, we had limited knowledge. However, after receiving specific education, we began to change our habits. Now, we prioritize climbing during the day as the risks are undoubtedly smaller. As the night approached, we had prepared ourselves to start the climb. Just before taking the first step, someone approached us and asked to join because they were climbing alone. Not minding at all, we invited him to join us in conquering Mount Sumbing through its trails leading to the highest peak. I forgot his name. Let's just call him Wahid, a student from Yogyakarta. Step by step, we walked away from the village and all its activities. Darkness began to accompany our journey. With only the light from our flashlights to drive away the darkness and some conversation to break the silence, we continued our journey. Indeed, it was quiet. As it turned out, we were not in sync with other groups of climbers. It feels like we're not alone, guys. I've been feeling like someone is following us from behind. I don't know if you've sensed it or not, said Mr. Wahid as we began to leave the area of the villagers' plantations. Actually, I've been feeling the same way as Mr. Wahid, but I haven't mentioned it since earlier. Apart from my courage, which was as small as a pea at that time, I had also heard that if we feel something strange in the mountains, it's best not to talk about it until we return. Yes, sir, I replied shortly, not denying Mr. Wahid's words. Not long after we discussed that, suddenly the rain started to fall. Actually, it was normal to happen as it was the rainy season, but for some reason, I felt something peculiar at the moment. We decided to continue the journey wearing our raincoats. However, when we were almost reaching checkpoint 2, suddenly there was a very loud thunderclap near us. Instantly, we ran searching for a shelter from the lightning strike that we believed might happen again. Without much consideration, we stopped at checkpoint 2, which had a shelter made of wooden planks with walls and a roof made of zinc. Undeniably, fear and panic were now creeping into our souls. Mr. Wahid, who was indeed the oldest and had more experience among us, tried to calm me and Anton down. He endeavored to create an atmosphere to prevent excessive panic that could make the situation even more dangerous. While outside, the rain continued to pour heavily, accompanied by lightning striking with a relatively high intensity. Very close, I was sure the lightning struck very near our position, evident from the almost non-existent gap between the flash of lightning and its sound. Let's just stop here. It's dangerous if we insist on continuing the journey, said Mr. Wahid. Yes, sir, I replied shortly, agreeing with Mr. Wahid's advice. Make a fire, there's a pile of dry wood in that corner. No need to set up a tent, we can rest here, I added Mr. Wahid. We divided the tasks. Anton and I gathered dry wood and arranged it in the middle of the shelter, where the remnants of a previous fire were visible. Meanwhile, Mr. Wahid focused on preparing his cooking equipment. After arranging the wood, we began to try to light it. Not long after, I suddenly froze. My entire body felt numb and I couldn't move. A very strong sense of fear overwhelmed me. My eyes now seemed stiff, staring at something in front of me. Right in front of the shelter, under a large tree, I saw a pair of bright red eyes gleaming sharply, staring at the three of us and piercing through the thickening darkness of the night due to the pouring rain. I couldn't see any other parts of its body, only a pair of eyes shining like two mini LED lights placed side by side. For a while, I couldn't move my body at all. My entire body was shivering intensely. My mouth was locked and I couldn't utter a single word. I desperately wanted to scream for help from my friends who were here, but only silence came out of my mouth. Until finally, Anton snapped me out of it by giving me a tap on my shoulder. "Why, Anton said. "I saw theirs." "Stop. Just be quiet. No need to say it," Mr. Wahid interrupted me. I redirected my gaze to where the pair of eyes were, but all I saw was darkness. The pair of eyes had vanished somewhere. I tried to ignore what I had seen earlier and continued my activity of lighting the fire with Anton. However, what I felt now was the continuous horror that enveloped me. It was unclear whether it was just me or if Anton and Mr. Wahid felt it too. I felt as if there were countless unseen entities around us, surrounding the shelter we used as protection from the rain and lightning. The night grew darker, and I couldn't determine what time it was since none of us had a time indicator among us. No other climbers came here or even passed by. Perhaps the weather below wasn't much different, so some other climbers decided to abandon their intention to climb tonight. The tense atmosphere thickened in this place. Fortunately, the fire we made earlier was burning perfectly. At least, it could provide a little peace through its radiant light and the warmth it produced. The food cooked by Mr. Wahid was also ready. Although it was just instant noodles with canned fish as a side dish, it was enough to be an energy supply for navigating through this night. While we were enjoying this simple yet special dinner, we were suddenly startled by a loud noise from one of the shelter walls. We were all surprised. Even the nesting pot that I was holding was instantly thrown because of my shock. We heard one of the shelter walls being struck or hit with something. For a moment, we looked at each other. No words were spoken among us, but what we felt seemed to be the same. Shock, fear, dread, and curiosity all at once. Mr. Wahid slowly stood up, and I followed suit. The curiosity about what happened managed to make me set aside my fear. I followed Mr. Wahid as he walked outside and then turned to the side of the shelter through the edge that was not affected by the rain. When we arrived at the part of the wall that we believed was struck or hit by an object earlier, we found a piece of a tree branch lying there. The tree branch looked wet and dirty with the typical red mountain soil. There were also traces of mud on the wall. Apparently, this wooden branch was thrown against the shelter wall. So, the question is, who threw it? Who do you think threw it, sir? It seems like no one has come here since earlier, I said. Before Mr. Wahid could answer, suddenly there was a sound from behind the bushes in front of us. A sound like footsteps being dragged through the dense bushes. Something like that. Spontaneously, Mr. Wahid pulled out a machete from his waist. You go inside, let me check. It might be a wild animal, Mr. Wahid said. I'll come too, sir, I replied because I was curious to know what kind of animal was trying to disturb us. Or perhaps it was our arrival that disturbed its peace. Bring some sort of weapon, a stick or something, just to be safe, Mr. Wahid said, not preventing me from joining him. Mr. Wahid started walking through the dense but not too tightly packed bushes. I followed him from behind, staying vigilant, afraid that there might be a sudden attack from a wild animal. Behind the bushes, we found nothing. There were no traces of animals either. As I was inspecting the area around me, suddenly Mr. Wahid jumped and ran further away. I also ran after him, although I didn't understand who or what he was chasing. As I got closer to him, I briefly saw in front of Mr. Wahid was a fairly deep valley, or precisely, a ravine. Although vague, I could still recognize its contours. And unfortunately, Mr. Wahid kept running towards the ravine. I tried to call Mr. Wahid, but he completely ignored my call. As we got closer to the edge of the ravine, I once again saw a pair of glowing eyes looking in our direction. Realizing that something was wrong, I quickened my pace and leaped towards Mr. Wahid's body. Both of us fell and rolled, almost falling into the ravine. Fortunately, we were still safe. Our breaths were both racing, irregular. After trying to calm down, Mr. Wahid also regained consciousness. How did we end up here, Hen? Mr. Wahid said. You suddenly ran for no reason, sir. That's why I followed. But you ran towards the ravine. I shouted and called you, but you didn't respond. So I jumped to catch you. I was afraid you'd fall into the ravine, sir, I explained to him. Oh, but I felt like I was just walking normally, Hen. I was following a bird earlier. So, behind the bushes, I found a small black bird with yellow and red patterns. Because it looked nice to me, I tried to catch it because the bird seemed friendly. I just followed it until suddenly I fell here with you, and Mr. Wahid explained to me. Well, this doesn't make sense, sir. There are no birds at this time, especially in the rain like this. And we seem to be too far now, sir. We should go back to the shelter. But I'm not sure I remember the way we came, I said, realizing that something was wrong. For a while, Mr. Wahid observed the surrounding area. Perhaps he was trying to recognize this place because he had climbed Mount Sumbing several times, so he might have some familiarity with the mountain area. I'm not sure if I remember, but I somewhat recognize this place, and let's just go back to the shelter. Follow me, and Mr. Wahid said and began to move. I followed him. Not far into our walk, suddenly I saw a figure of a creature that was very large, maybe about 4 to 5 meters tall. The figure looked blurry, like a dark cloud forming a body silhouette. Its eyes were clearly glowing red. Instantly, I stopped in my tracks. Then I grabbed Mr. Wahid's shoulder to stop him because the figure was standing right in front of us, blocking our path. The creature remained standing upright without moving at all. Nevertheless, its gaze felt extremely terrifying. It stared sharply at us. Its eyes seemed to have the power to make us weak, attacked by fear. Mr. Wahid, who also realized the disturbance, was unable to do anything. He just stood frozen in front of me. Sir, what should we do? I said to Mr. Wahid. Just wait for a moment. Recite any prayer you know, and Mr. Wahid replied. Yes, we couldn't do anything, especially me, who had minimal experience in the mountains, especially when it came to mystical things. I just followed Mr. Wahid's instructions, as he likely had more experience than I did. After a while, Mr. Wahid signaled for me to follow him. He walked a bit around, avoiding the location where the creature had blocked us. In the thick fog, we walked in an uncertain direction. Our vision was severely obstructed, and even the flashlight we carried couldn't help illuminate the way. Passing through irregular terrain that sometimes required us to penetrate dense bushes, we kept walking, until finally we encountered a footpath that we believed was the climbing route. "This is the climbing trail, Hen, but it seems like we're above Camp 2, Mr. Wahid said. "Let's go down. Let's go to the camp. It's not fair to leave Anton alone," he continued. "Let's go, sir. I'll follow you," I replied. So we walked downhill, and a few moments later, indeed, we arrived at Camp 2, the place where we had rested before. Arriving at the camp, I saw Anton still sitting near the fireplace. He just sat there, staring at the fire, which was not too big. Even when Mr. Wahid and I entered and greeted him, he didn't respond at all. Until I touched his shoulder, and suddenly, he jumped while screaming in fear. "Ton, calm down. Ton, calm down. It's me, Henry, and Mr. Wahid," I said to reassure him. After realizing that it was indeed me and Mr. Wahid, Anton finally became a bit calmer. "What happened, Ton?" I continued to ask. Anton then recounted the horror experience he had after Mr. Wahid and I left him alone. He told us that he was disturbed by creatures lurking in this area, to the point where his life was almost threatened. In the end, he didn't dare to look anywhere except at the fire until Mr. Wahid and I arrived. Anton's POV. This climb is indeed not like usual. Even though I have only climbed a few mountains, I can distinguish between a comfortable and an uncomfortable atmosphere when on a mountain, especially when it comes to mystical aspects. Since the beginning of the journey, I have felt uneasy. I sense that I am being followed by something I cannot name. I believe I have not violated any taboos, and I'm sure Henry hasn't either. But I don't know about Mr. Wahid, the person I just met at the base camp who joined Henry and me on this climb. Hopefully, nothing bad will happen later. Throughout the journey, I kept trying to fight this uneasy feeling, until finally we reached Camp 2. Due to unfavorable weather conditions, we decided to rest at Camp 2 for the night. It seemed too dangerous to continue the climb. After lighting a campfire and with the food cooked by Mr. Anton ready, we enjoyed dinner together, until we were startled by a loud noise, like the wall of the shack being hit by something. It's worth noting that this shack is made of wood for its frame, and its walls and roof are made of metal sheets. So, when struck, it produces a very loud noise. Mr. Wahid and Henry took the initiative to check outside. They were concerned about the possibility of wild animals approaching. I deliberately didn't join them. Besides being lazy, my food had not been fully enjoyed. At least they wouldn't take too long, so it's better for me to stay here. That was my thought. After the two of them went outside, I relaxed again, enjoying my dinner while warming myself by the campfire. After a while, I realized they had been outside for too long without returning. Henry, I shouted, calling them. If he were outside the shack, he should have heard my shout. But there was no response at all from there, neither from Henry nor Mr. Wahid. Feeling a bit worried about their situation, I took the initiative to check outside. I walked around towards the location where Henry and Mr. Wahid were earlier. But when I arrived at the spot, I found no one. Where could they be? Damn, I've been left alone, I thought. While inspecting the surroundings, I noticed something lying on the ground. It had a round shape, like a ball. Whether it was foolishness or perhaps due to the push of curiosity, I approached the object to examine it. I leaned my head towards the object to get a clearer view. As I was scrutinizing it, suddenly a pair of eyes opened from the object. Yes, that's correct. The object turned out to be a head. I was startled to the point of almost stumbling. Still in my surprise, suddenly the head floated towards me. This time, the open mouth with sharp teeth was visible. I heard a loud and intimidating laughter. Yes, indeed, this time I was truly terrified. I tried to avoid the creature, but I was confused about where to go. Right now, I was completely alone. Henry and Mr. Wahid were nowhere to be found. Every place felt unsafe for me at the moment. I tried to move slowly to avoid the creature. At least I had to get inside the shelter first. Who knows, I might be safe in there. As I moved, the head-shaped creature without a body floating in front of me remained still, not moving. However, its eyes continued to stare at me. Its mouth was still open, emitting a disgustingly slimy substance. I tried to ignore it. However, when I successfully avoided the creature and was about to go towards the front of the shelter from the side, I saw a figure with very long hair and wearing white blocking my path. Perhaps this was what they call a Kundalanic. The distance between the Kundalanic and me was very close, maybe only about 2 meters. She didn't move at all, but from my ears, I heard her distinctive laughter, a chilling, echoing, eerie laughter that seemed to resonate from afar. Panic, that's what I felt right now. I was truly confused about what to do. I was being confronted by terrifying creatures from both the front and the back, and their presence was the last thing I expected. With the remaining shreds of courage I had, I ran away towards the thick bushes beside the shelter. I thought of avoiding both creatures first, then turning around and heading back towards the shelter. As I ran, suddenly my feet seemed to trip over something, like a root, causing me to stumble. I tried to catch my breath. For a moment, I looked back, and fortunately, the 2 creatures didn't follow me. I felt a bit relieved. However, when I looked ahead again, I was instantly frozen in place. Right in front of me now stood a gigantic creature with long fur covering its entire body. Horns protruded from its head, its eyes glowing red, and it had long fangs visible in its mouth. The creature stared at me with a sinister grin. In the grip of fear that had completely taken over me, I could no longer move my body. Every joint felt incredibly stiff. I couldn't even close my eyes. It was as if I were forced to keep looking at the creature in front of me. All I hoped for at this moment was to faint, so I wouldn't have to witness this horror anymore. However, somehow, my consciousness remained entirely intact. Not long after, the creature started to move, particularly its hands. Briefly, I saw sharp claws behind the fur covering its hands. With its very long arms, it moved as if reaching out to me, or perhaps more accurately, preparing to attack me with its claws. I tried to move my body to evade, but in vain. My entire body remained stiff. Just as the creature's hand was about to reach me, suddenly, everything went dark. I had lost consciousness. I felt the cold all over my body, even sensing that my clothes were wet. Slowly, I opened my eyes. Darkness was the first thing I perceived with my gaze. However, gradually, I noticed a flickering orange light that moved irregularly. As my eyesight fully returned, I realized that what I saw was fire. The fire from the fireplace we had made inside the shelter. It turns out I was now in front of the shelter. I had no idea how I ended up here. The last thing I remembered, I was somewhat far from the side of the shelter, confronted by a large black creature that was about to attack me. Slowly, I moved my body. I tried to stand up and walk towards the shelter. I needed to change my clothes, soaked by the rain, with dry ones. That was the first thing on my mind, as I was afraid of hypothermia. As I staggered inside, I once again heard voices, crying, laughter, people talking, and footsteps. Relentless. Despite the difficulty, I finally made it inside the shelter. I quickly changed my clothes and sat near the fire. I continued sitting by the fire, staring into its warmth. I didn't dare to look around, fully aware that there were numerous supernatural entities surrounding me. Even from the corner of my eye, I could see them. Sometimes it looked like a Pokemon, then a Kundalanic, followed by the figure of an old person, and changing again to a large dark figure. It went on and on. I couldn't even count how many different apparitions appeared. Until some time later, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I jumped in fear and screamed, "Ton, come down, Ton. It's me, Henry, and Mr. Wahid," he said. At first, I was still skeptical, afraid that it might be a supernatural being impersonating my friend, Henry. But after observing for a moment, it turned out to be them indeed. I was very relieved that they had returned here. Not only relieved because they were okay, but also relieved because I was no longer alone. So, at least, we could face our fears together. There wasn't much we could do tonight. The atmosphere didn't change much. Only the rain was gradually subsiding, but still leaving a drizzle that thickened the tense atmosphere. The three of us were still sitting around the fire that we kept alive. Fortunately, there was still an ample supply of dry wood, so we didn't have to worry about the fire going out due to a lack of fuel. Outside, there were still many activities of the mountain inhabitants, often displaying their existence. Sometimes we heard footsteps beside the shack, the sound of objects being thrown onto the roof, creating a rather noisy commotion that managed to startle us, and the fleeting shadows passing in front of the shack. But none of them manifested their forms in front of us as they did in front of Anton earlier. None of us could sleep. The fear enveloping us forced us to stay awake. As the night grew later, who knows what time it was, Mr. Wahid was seen slowly lying down in front of the fireplace. Perhaps he was already too tired. Anton and I remained awake, chatting about various topics. Neither of us intended to sleep because we were afraid of disturbances while we were asleep. While we were enjoying our coffee, Mr. Wahid suddenly stood up and looked outside the shack. He stood there for quite some time without doing anything. Anton and I just watched him, curious about what he was going to do. Suddenly, Mr. Wahid began talking to himself, or more precisely, he was rambling incoherently because it was unclear what he was saying. After a while, he abruptly ran out into the darkness and the gentle yet eerie rain. Anton and I exchanged glances after witnessing Mr. Wahid's behavior. Realizing that something was amiss, both of us grabbed flashlights and went out to search for Mr. Wahid, concerned about his safety. Despite our recent acquaintance as fellow mountain climbers, especially since we were climbing together in one team, we felt a sense of brotherhood. Anton and I scoured the surroundings of the campsite to find Mr. Wahid, but he was nowhere to be found. We occasionally shouted his name, hoping he would respond. Not a single response reached our ears. Instead, we heard strange sounds from the mountain's inhabitants. Laughter, people conversing, and even the faint roar of a tiger that we could barely discern over the sound of the rain. Feeling defeated in our search, we decided to return to the shelter. Perhaps Mr. Wahid had already come back. Upon reaching the shelter, relief washed over us as we found Mr. Wahid inside, sitting facing the fireplace. "Where were you earlier, mister?" I asked as I approached him. There was no response from Mr. Wahid. He completely ignored our presence, staying silent while gazing at the fire. Mr. Wahid," I called out again. He remained frozen, paying no attention to us. When I tried to touch his shoulder, he abruptly pushed my hand away and stared at me sharply. I, startled, took a few steps back. Similarly, Anton did the same. Mr. Wahid then stood up and stared at both of us alternately, maintaining his intense gaze. However, this time, he accompanied it with a terrifying, menacing smile. We were genuinely frightened by his actions. "You're all intruders," Mr. Wahid growled, interspersed with roars resembling a tiger's. Perhaps this was possession, I thought. It seemed similar to what people had recounted before. I truly had no clear idea of how to handle someone in a possessed state. This might be my first encounter witnessing it directly. Honestly, I was confused about how to deal with it. "He must come with me," and Mr. Wahid spoke again. Feeling cornered, I mustered my courage. Regardless, we had to ensure our safety. That's what I thought. "Who are you, and what do you want?" I asked sternly, addressing Mr. Wahid, or rather, the entity within him. "I am the ruler of this territory. You audaciously entered my domain and brought something that defiles it." He continued. What did the creature mean? As far as I could remember, we came here respectfully. Even all the waste we produced, we gathered to take down with us the next day. So, what exactly were we defiling? I pondered, a bit puzzled. "What do you mean? We didn't defile anything. Leave my friend's body immediately," I exclaimed. "He must come with me." Ha 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 ha. After saying that, Mr. Wahid suddenly leaped over the fire, heading directly to the front of the shed, which was a slightly wide open area. There, he crawled around like a tiger, continuously growling. Occasionally, he rolled around and scratched the ground, occasionally eating it. Yes, he was eating the wet red soil in front of the shed. Anton and I quickly approached Mr. Wahid. I tried to capture him, but every time I grabbed him, he immediately resisted, even throwing me aside. His strength was truly extraordinary. Anton and I were overwhelmed facing Mr. Wahid, who was possessed. For some time, we struggled with each other until our entire bodies and clothes were now wet and dirty from the mud. Perhaps sensing some resistance, the entity possessing Mr. Wahid now went berserk. Using Mr. Wahid's body, it began to try to attack us. Fortunately, I had previously studied martial arts, so to some extent, I could use martial arts techniques to avoid Mr. Wahid's attacks. Until at one point, I found a little opportunity when Mr. Wahid was attacking Anton, so his defense was slightly open. Not wanting to waste the opportunity, I immediately threw a right punch towards Mr. Wahid's left cheek. Somehow, when my punch landed squarely, Mr. Wahid immediately fell without moving. I fell to my knees. I felt my whole body ache, and I was extremely tired. My breath was racing. I saw Anton's condition wasn't much different from mine. I tried to catch my breath. When I had calmed down a bit, I approached Mr. Wahid. His body was still lying on the ground. I checked on him, and it turned out he was still breathing. That meant he had just fainted. I was afraid something might happen to him, but on second thought, it seemed unlikely that I could harm him with just one punch. Together with Anton, I carried Mr. Wahid into the shelter. Anton took off Mr. Wahid's clothes, while I rummaged through his backpack to find dry clothes. Luckily, I found some. Quickly, we changed his wet clothes with dry ones. Wearing wet clothes in this situation posed a risk of hypothermia. After changing Mr. Wahid's clothes, the three of us took turns changing into dry clothes. After changing, we all sat back near the fireplace to warm ourselves. We also boiled water for later use. After some time, Mr. Wahid began to move. It seemed like he was regaining consciousness. Mr. Wahid seemed to still be processing the events he experienced, likely related to what happened to his body. Anton and I tried to lighten the mood, choosing not to tell him directly about the possession incident he went through. "Oh, why does my cheek hurt so much?" Mr. Wahid said as his consciousness returned. Earlier, we don't know why, Mr. Wahid suddenly lost consciousness, then ran outside and hit a tree in front of us. Oh, I lied. I thought it was best not to tell him the real story, at least until we descended tomorrow. Anton agreed with me. "Did you guys change my clothes?" he asked again. "Yes, we did, mister. Earlier, you got wet and dirty because of the rain," Anton replied. "Weird. I thought I was sleeping. Why suddenly wake up with my whole body aching? My cheek hurts a lot, like I've been punched. And you guys already changed my clothes. What actually happened?" Mr. Wahid asked again. "Let's talk about it tomorrow when we're down. I also have something to ask you," I replied. "All right. Now you guys better rest. I'll take over the watch," he continued. "We're already not sleepy, mister. Besides, it seems like it's almost morning. We might as well sleep at the base camp later. For now, let's enjoy some coffee." Hee, Anton replied, lightening the mood a bit. In the end, the three of us endured the night, sharing stories while enjoying coffee and cigarettes. Unnoticed, the day began to brighten, and a sunny morning replaced the mysterious night. The rain had stopped, leaving a fresh atmosphere with the warm morning sunlight. After breakfast and tidying up, we decided not to continue the climb. This decision was based on our physical exhaustion and the haunting memories of the previous night. We agreed to descend to the base camp together. The descent went smoothly without any notable incidents. Upon reaching the base camp, we started discussing the events of the previous night. Anton and I shared our experiences, including the moment when I had to throw a punch at Mr. Wahid. He didn't feel angry. In fact, he was grateful for being saved by both of us. "Oh, by the way, last night you mentioned you wanted to ask something, Hen?" Mr. Wahid inquired. "Yes, mister. Actually, what does Mr. Wahid carry? Why did the mountain guardians get angry at us?" I asked. Finally, Mr. Wahid revealed that he brought some kind of an amulet to protect himself. It seemed that the mountain guardians didn't like what he brought, or there was some conflicting energy, causing them to threaten us, especially Mr. Wahid. Regarding the incident when I could suddenly knock down Mr. Wahid with a single punch, it remains a mystery to this day. I feel like I never had any amulet or anything of the sort. Actually, I'm not the type of person who is interested in supernatural things. My self-confidence was the main factor when I managed to knock him down with a single punch. Nevertheless, Mr. Wahid repeatedly apologized for the incident that could have been fatal for both of us. As a form of apology, he decided to treat us to a satisfying meal at the base camp. As evening approached, we decided to head home. Anton and I planned to go to Damanga, while Mr. Wahid returned to his hometown. At that time, we exchanged addresses, even though it was only physical addresses as we didn't have mobile phones at that time. Unfortunately, the address Mr. Wahid provided disappeared somewhere. Such was the story of our failed to climb on Mount Sumbing at that time. Hopefully, from this story, there are lessons to be learned. If we experience a bad situation, we should consider it as a learning opportunity to avoid repeating it in the future. As humans, it's advisable to always respect every place we visit. There is no reason to be arrogant about what we have or know, as it can backfire and harm ourselves. Hopefully, this story of climbing Mount Sumbing can provide inspiration and reflection for the readers. Thanks for watching.